First and foremost, I would like to thank the Foreign Policy Association, in particular. Noel, your leadership has been exceptional, along with the Korean Institute for Unification. I would also like to acknowledge the very hard work of Adam and Cole and a number of the staff who have done so much to bring this event together. And I'd also like to acknowledge a special guest, my mother, Emily, who is here in the room, as well as my sister, Carolyn, who is here with some of her students. So today, the job of my role is to really facilitate a great and rich discussion. Each member of the panel will speak for roughly about 5 minutes, and then we will have, and then I'll open up with a few questions, and then we'll open up the rest of the questions for the audience. I just wanted to introduce briefly Robert Einhorn, who is a senior fellow in the Arms Control and Nonproliferation Initiative and the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, both housed within the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Welcome. I'd also like to introduce Joel Witt, who is concurrently a senior fellow at the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS and a senior research fellow at Columbia University Weatherhead Institute for East Asian Studies. And a small anecdote, so in 2003, I was a freshly minted research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we're doing a report on the North Korean nuclear challenge. And I just happened to notice that Joel was actually part of that panel, the part of the members on that task force. And late last night, about 12 midnight, I actually went to my bookshelf to see if I could actually find that report, and I actually was able to find it. So Joel, your historical contributions are still being recognized and acknowledged today.
And it's still relevant.
And
right?
it's still relevant. That's right.
Evergreen.
Our third panelist is Mr. Ankit Panda. Ankit is an editor at The Diplomat, where he authors daily analysis and commentaries. One of the unique things and what you may not know about Ankit is that he actually writes coding for fun. And he was previously an actor who also performed in both English and French, if I'm correct. So just something that you may not know about Ankit. So with that, I will let the panelists, we'll start with Ankit first, and then we'll go along. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot for that introduction, Earl. And thank you to the Foreign Policy Association and Kinu and Ambassador Kim. Good to see you again. I think this will be familiar for you because you heard me speak last week on a very similar topic. So today's October 19th, and actually I like that date. It gives me a good place to start because last year, 2016, on October 19th, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are headed into the third presidential debate, and North Korea actually carried out its 24th and final ballistic missile launch for the year. So 2016 seemed like an exceptional year around this time last year. More missile launches than we'd seen. It was the first year we saw 2 nuclear tests out of North Korea. One that they claimed was a thermonuclear device, and the other that they claimed was a standardized device for their ballistic missiles. But I think 2017 has demonstrated that this threat from North Korea has grown to a new level of severity. And when I say that, I don't want to suggest that any of this is surprising. I think for observers of North Korea's ballistic missile programs for some time, the developments we've seen this year were effectively seen as an inevitable progress for their program. They've been very clear about their aspirations to strike the U.S. homeland. We've seen propaganda footage coming out of North Korea showing Washington, D.C., San Francisco, San Diego in flames, and in 2017, they've put a little bit more credibility behind that propaganda, and that has implications for U.S. policy options, certainly has implications for coercive denuclearization. There's 2 forms of getting to denuclearization. One of those is coercive, and the other is voluntary, where North Korea is willing to come to the table. So I'll just very briefly talk about what we've seen this year. So the United States intelligence community uses a numbering system to keep track of North Korea's significant strategic weapons systems. It's known as the KN system. If you read news reports, CNN, you might see KN followed by a certain number that refers to a specific North Korean system. So at the end of 2016, we were at KN-14. It was a ICBM that we'd first seen in 2015 that had never been flight tested. And the KN system started in the mid-90s. So just to give you an idea of how long it took for North Korea to get from KN-01 to KN-14, it took a while. This year, As of August, we have arrived at KN21. So they've gone from KN14 to 21 in 2017 in just a matter of months. And a lot of these new missile systems that we've seen this year are quite concerning. And in the Q&A, I'll maybe get to a few of the other systems, but I want to focus on two of these systems that have the largest implications for U.S. strategy and really underline why coercive denuclearization is a worse option than it has ever been. I don't think it was a particularly good option before because of the well-known threat that North Korea has been able to present to South Korea with its conventional biological and chemical capabilities, but now we are in a slightly different place. So one of these systems is the Hwasong-12. It's the missile that they tested on August 29th and September 14th, the one that they flew over Japan twice. And this missile is the first that North Korea has been able to credibly demonstrate is capable of ranging the U.S. territory of Guam, where Pacific Command's permanent bomber presence for the Asia-Pacific is based. So the September launch flew to a range in excess of what North Korea would need to target Guam. And that has implications for North Korea's eventual nuclear warfighting plans. We can talk a bit about their nuclear strategy during the Q&A as well, but effectively all you need to know is that it relies on a nuclear first strike against U.S. military assets and South Korean and potentially Japanese assets in Northeast Asia. The ICBM, on the other hand, we saw tested for the first time on July 4th this year. July 4th, incidentally, was also the same day North Korea broke its ballistic missile testing moratorium in 2006, so that date does carry some importance for them apart from being the U.S. Independence Day. And they tested that missile again on July 28th, and that missile introduces the old Cold War threat of decoupling to Northeast Asia and makes U.S. alliance management a more difficult task than it has ever been. Decoupling, very briefly, is the credibility problem that now the United States has to make it clear to Seoul and Tokyo that if push came to shove, if a conflict did break out on the Korean Peninsula, that the United States would be willing to potentially expose New York, Los Angeles to nuclear retaliation from North Korea and credibly defend its allies. And that's not a difficult task, and that's why we've seen extended deterrence language in recent high-level statements between Japanese officials and U.S. officials, South Korean officials and U.S. officials, and that's something we'll see going forward. So I'll stop there, and we can come back to any of those issues in the Q&A. Thanks.
All right. Bob.
Earl, thank you, and thanks to Foreign Policy Association for hosting this event. Given the high stakes, and Ankit has mentioned what North Korea is up to, it's very important that we have a realistic appreciation of what is achievable in this area of trying to stop the North Korean programs. The approach that the Trump administration is pursuing is to try to apply irresistible pressure against North Korea in the hope of getting it to decide that it's in its best interest to abandon its nuclear and missile programs completely and very soon. This would be a great outcome. Unfortunately, I don't think it's achievable. Why? For two main reasons. One, and this was alluded to in the previous panel, China I think there's a ceiling to how much pressure China is prepared to place on North Korea. Beijing is deeply disturbed with North Korea's behavior. Chinese leaders have disdain for Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership, and as mentioned in the earlier panel, China indeed has taken some serious steps in recent weeks to enforce sanctions and to apply additional pressures against the North. But it's clear that China is going to stop short of placing pressure on the North that could destabilize the regime and ultimately lead to its collapse. Second reason, also alluded to in the earlier panel, is that even if pressures would be applied much more strenuously, Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear capability. He sees these nuclear weapons as essential to deterring the United States, which he sees as a paramount threat, and also essential to the survival of the regime, of the Kim dynasty. President Trump may feel that his belligerent statements fire and fury, totally destroying North Korea, taunting Kim Jong-un as little rocket man. He may think that these statements will intimidate Kim Jong-un and compel him to abandon his nuclear capability. Actually, I think these statements are counterproductive. They convince Kim Jong-un that the United States is permanently hostile to North Korea and that the North must hold on to its nuclear deterrent indefinitely. In my view, trying to press North Korea till it abandons its programs completely and in the near term is just a bridge too far. The use of military force has also been mentioned as a possible way of resolving this issue of attacking North Korea's nuclear and missile sites. But there are problems with that approach. One, we don't know the location of all of these nuclear and missile facilities. But more fundamentally, U.S. military leaders, Secretary of Defense Mattis, Chairman of the Joint Chief Dunford, they understand very well that initiating the use of military force would involve risks beyond imagination, and they've spoken about that. Another approach that's been mentioned is regime change. Try to topple this regime as a way of getting rid of the North's nuclear and missile capabilities. But success of this approach is also very unlikely. Kim Jong-un has successfully ensured the loyalty of North Korea's elite through a combination of rewards and brutal intimidation. And China will go to great lengths to ensure that its neighbor, that the Kim regime will remain in charge, will stay afloat. I think efforts to get North Korea to give up its programs completely and in the near term are bound to fail. And when they do, I think it would be desirable to pursue a more modest, but I think more achievable approach. And that's a phased approach to denuclearization, starting with an interim freeze on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. What an interim freeze would do is suspend all nuclear tests and all flight tests of long-range missiles, and it would suspend the production of fissile materials, the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium that could be used to manufacture nuclear weapons. Now, such a freeze, if effective, would put a cap on the size of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. It would impede further advances in the miniaturization of North Korea's nuclear warheads, and it would limit the reliability and the accuracy of North Korea's missiles. But after all, it's only a freeze. And the problem is that it would allow North Korea to keep the nuclear weapons and the nuclear materials it has already produced. An interim deal would probably, in my view, should require North Korea to commit to continue negotiations toward the goal of complete denuclearization, but it wouldn't have a deadline because I can't see the North Koreans agreeing to a specific time frame to achieve that goal. An interim freeze would have certain limitations, and it would be heavily criticized. The critics would say that this freeze without a definite time frame from complete denuclearization would constitute de facto acceptance, recognition of a North Korean nuclear weapons capability, and there's some validity to that charge. Critics would also claim that any verification arrangements worked out would be inadequate. I have my own ideas on what would be involved, but they would be hardly foolproof in a country, the size of North Korea, with a regime that's been so adept at hiding things in the country. The interim freeze would be criticized because the North wouldn't do it for free. The North would insist on some form of compensation, whether it's in terms of scaling back current sanctions. They would call for removing U.S. forces from South Korea, call for a permanent peace treaty to replace the armistice. There would be a variety of things they would call for, including perhaps even financial assistance. Critics would charge that whatever would be provided to the North to compensate them would be unjustified. And even if it would be possible to satisfy these critics, it's far from clear that the North would actually be interested in an interim freeze. I'm sure there would be those in North Korea who would claim this will get us on a slippery slope, inevitably toward the complete denuclearization, which we cannot afford to do. I doubt, at this stage at least, President Trump or his senior advisors would accept an interim freeze. Their view is that we need to have the early and complete denuclearization of the North. It's too serious a threat, and we don't know if we can deter them. And even if somehow President Trump could be persuaded to go for a freeze, I think it would be hard to get an agreement on terms that would be politically palatable in the United States. So I think if Trump decided not to go for a freeze, and if it proved impossible to get a good agreement, I think inevitably we would be forced to fall back on a long-term strategy of deterrence and containment. We'd continue to pressure the North, try to reduce its hard currency earnings, try to impede its access to technologies and materials they use in their nuclear and missile programs. We'd press China very hard to stop facilitating North Korea's illicit programs. And most important, we would work very closely with our South Korean and Japanese allies to bolster alliance deterrence and defense capabilities. But the problem with this approach is that essentially it would concede, without any agreement, without any negotiations, that the North Koreans could continue to advance their nuclear and missile programs, and we would expect them to continue to build up these programs. So in my view, I believe that we should make an effort to achieve this interim freeze, but I have no illusion that it's going to be easy to do that. But I think it's worth trying, because having tried an approach that I think would have broad international support, including with China and the current government in South Korea, but having failed because North Korea was not prepared to accept a reasonable approach, I think we would put ourselves in a much stronger position to gain the international support necessary to sustain a policy of deterrence and containment over the long haul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Joel.
Thanks, Earl. Thanks for inviting me. Most of us up here spend a lot of time talking to the media, and they're always interested in lists, 10 different reasons why this, or 5 different reasons why this. So I have a list for you of 3 different things that you need to pay attention to. And I think the first thing is be skeptical about the emerging argument for military action. You see pieces of this in the press and also privately. The administration is quietly making a case for military action in the short term. And they say the choice is between war or accepting and deterring North Korea's nuclear weapons. And Accepting and deterring, and I agree with everything that Bob has said, but from this perspective, accepting and deterring is unacceptable because Kim Jong-un is irrational, and North Korea is not building weapons to defend itself. It's building weapons because it wants to force the U.S. off the peninsula and reunify Korea under its own terms, and therefore can't be deterred. So the logic is war now is better than later because later on North Korea will have more weapons. Don't agree with this logic, but people are making a case that puts together all of these different assumptions, and they're false assumptions. We don't know if Kim Jong-un is irrational, and I would say he isn't irrational. We have a few years of experience watching him and seeing what he's doing. And for those of us who have observed North Korea for a long time, what he's doing makes perfect sense if you're a North Korean. Secondly, the idea of aggressive reunification, it's possible, but it assumes that, the U.S. is just going to roll over and play dead, and that's not going to happen. So there are a lot of holes in this case that I think people need to be thinking about. Secondly, we say we will accept talks on our terms. And so that sounds like we want to have diplomacy going on. And indeed, we do have some diplomacy going on. I don't want to be unfair to Secretary Tillerson, who's labored mightily to have some talks with North Korea, and there are quiet talks. The problem here is that, like many past administrations, this administration has conditions for talking to North Korea and conditions to talking to them in a sustained and serious way. And the problem there is, of course, whenever you want to talk to someone and you impose preconditions on talking to them, they're going to think you're not serious, and that's exactly the point. So the North Koreans have been signaling, actually, since last November when Bob and I were in a meeting with a bunch of North Korean officials in Geneva after President Trump was elected. They've been signaling they're open to having renewed dialogue with the United States. That probably has gone down a lot over the past 7 months, given everything that's happened, and particularly given the threats that have been exchanged at the United Nations. The fact here is, though, in order to even figure out whether the solution Bob has outlined, and I agree with everything he said on that too, the only way to figure it out is to sit down and talk to the North Koreans. You can't figure it out through reading their official media. It's just not going to happen. And you may need to sit with them for days and hours trying to figure it all out. The third point, and Bob just touched on this, is we aren't going to get something for nothing. Even the initial steps in what Bob has described, and the initial step, which we've talked about with the North Koreans, is a moratorium on nuclear tests and missile tests, which would be quite useful at this point. You need to give something to get that. And the key issue has been, although that may change as the sanctions pressure mounts on North Korea, the key issue has been joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises, and particularly 2 exercises that are held in late winter and late summer the North Korean Sea is very threatening. Publicly, they say, well, you got to cancel these exercises. Privately, I think they would accept altering the size of the exercises. The problem is, at least in the environment in Washington till recently, everyone saw that as appeasement. We don't want to do that because we're giving the North Koreans something that's going to undermine our ability to defend South Korea. But the point is, if you talk to almost every military man who has experience on the Korean Peninsula, they will tell you, sure, you can alter the exercises. We can have a different exercise plan and still maintain the security of our allies. So the issue is then, is it worth doing that in order to stop the forward momentum of these programs, the North Korean programs, and to try to move on to some of the solutions Bob has talked about? I'm not sure if it's still the case that we can come up with that kind of solution, given the way the situation has deteriorated over the past few months, but I still think it's worth a shot. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for exceptional comments and analysis. Bob, I want to start with you. If I could play devil's advocate for a second. You said one of your proposals is how to get North Korea to this phased approach. But you didn't talk about how do we get North Korea to this phased to this approach, because at this point we don't have any incentive to get North Korea to this point. So can you talk a little bit about, I mean, one could point to the sanctions that have been currently put in place, and to the Trump administration's credit, these are by far the most significant sanctions that have ever been put in place. I was speaking to an advisor to the UN ambassador, and she said something like 90% of all of North Koreans' exports right now have something like sanctions on them. So talk a little bit about how do we get to this point?
Well, I think you get to an interim freeze the way President Trump is trying to get to an early and complete denuclearization. You put maximum pressure on North Korea. I think what is happening is very positive. China is getting serious about sanctions. The U.S. has stopped pulling its punches. It's been prepared to sanction Chinese entities if China is not cooperating with the U.S. in pressuring North Korea. So I think you have to do all the things. You have to get countries that are hosting North Korean laborers who send remittances back to North Korea. You got to get them to send those workers home. You have to get countries that are buying North Korean military equipment to stop buying that equipment. You have to dry up their sources of hard currency and enforce the Security Council sanctions scrupulously. That's all in preparation, and that gives them incentive. The incentive is to stop the pain. One of the things I'm sure the North would ask would be to scale back some of these sanctions. And I think if we could get very serious constraints on North Korean capabilities, it would be worth scaling back some of these sanctions.
Thanks.
Can I add just
Joel.
a quick point? I agree with all that. We should be increasing pressure on North Korea. I think the danger is, and this has been happening for a long time, that many people see sanctions as the solution to the problem. And it's not the solution. It's not going to solve the problem. The North Koreans aren't going to roll over and play dead. They may come back to the negotiating table, but they may not. So increasing pressure is a good idea. We should be doing it, as long as we don't kid ourselves that somehow it obviates the need for other steps in our policy, like diplomacy. And that's been a problem for a long time now.
Okay, great. Ankit, I wanted to follow up with a question. You talked about the KN1 and how the system has gotten to, this KN1, this KN14, and, talk to us a little about the speed. How was North Korea able to accelerate so fast? You said KN1 to KN21? Is that?
14 to
KN
21 this
14
year.
to 21. How was North Korea able to develop with that amount of speed?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to be clear, we saw these systems unveiled this year. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were developed in, a matter of months. For example, the Musudan, which is the intermediate range missile that they tested 8 times last year, they didn't have a very good success rate with it. It flew successfully just 1 time. They've had that missile since the early 90s, and they've been working with that technology for some time. They did take away some important lessons from developing that. For example, the advanced propellants that they worked with in that missile are now at the heart of their ICBM and their intermediate range ballistic missile. And if I may, I just want to say something on sanctions and their ballistic missile program. There is this perception that I sometimes run into that maximum pressure and sanctions will have a direct effect on choking off the ballistic missile program, potentially reduced in lead to a reduced testing rate. We might not see North Korean ballistic missile tests almost bi-weekly, as we've seen this year. But increasingly, it appears to be a highly autarkic supply chain when it comes to their ballistic missile program. We saw some reporting in August, for example, that they were importing ballistic missile engine assemblies from the former Soviet Union, potentially Ukraine or Russia. That doesn't appear to be true anymore. I mean, they had those designs, but now they've been manufacturing those independently. At least that's what the United States intelligence community has assessed. When it comes to fissile material, which used to be kind of the major constraint on the size of their ultimate nuclear arsenal, that too appears to be increasingly less of a concern. I remember Joel's team in 2015 had released a report on North Korea's nuclear futures, and it had a worst case scenario projection for 2020 that they would have enough fissile material for 100 bombs, while the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency assessed this summer that they already have enough fissile material for 60 bombs, and they're producing fissile material at a rate of 12 per year. And this likely means that they have separative work units enriching uranium in sites that we just don't know about. And it means that their uranium enrichment program is proceeding at a fairly quick rate. And they've already demonstrated a thermonuclear design. So that means, while sanctions will have pain, I think, on the elite in Pyongyang and pressure the regime, and could potentially still influence North Korea's decision to return to the negotiating table, the actual missile program and its nuclear program, I think, remain quite well insulated. And because it is the insurance program for the regime's survival itself, I think that they'll keep marching on as long as they can with this highly autarkic supply chain.
Thank you. And last question before we go to the panel. Bilahari Kausikan, who was previously the former permanent secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, wrote a very provocative op-ed in the Washington Post on October 10th. The title of it was "To deter North Korea, Japan and South Korea should go nuclear." Can you talk a little bit about the implications of that for Korean unification?
Sorry, you're asking me?
Or any of the panels.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. For some time now, I think it's been pretty obvious as this program has gathered momentum, and as Ankit was saying, this is not new. For people who are following this issue, it's been very clear for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, that the nuclear program was growing and growing and growing. And, right away, that means that South Korea's future objective of reunification was really becoming more and more impractical. A nuclear North Korea is not going to agree to reunification on South Korea, in a peaceful process of reunification with South Korea, unless it's on their terms. So if South Korea gets nuclear weapons, it's not going to make it any more likely. I mean, it's going to be a standoff. And if Japan gets nuclear weapons, then obviously you're in a very unstable situation where, South Korea and North Korea are not just going to be looking at each other, but they're going to be looking at Japan because of the mixed history between all those countries. So, I hate to say it, but in a nuclear Northeast Asia, reunification just isn't going to be in the cards.
Yes.
And I can say it's not just the implication of South Korea getting nuclear weapons for reunification. I think it has very bad implications for that. I think if South Korea were to decide to have its own nuclear weapons program, this would lead to an arms race in Northeast Asia. If South Korea gets nuclear weapons, Japan undoubtedly will get nuclear weapons, and then you're off to the races. There are proponents in South Korea, and there are more and more of them now, who say that there needs to be a balance. Now there's an imbalance. North Korea has nuclear weapons. We don't. We're relying on the U.S. extended deterrent, but that may be getting unreliable. But if we had nuclear weapons to balance the North's nuclear weapons, that would set up a bargain. We'd be more likely to get rid of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. I think the opposite is true. I think if South Korea were to get nuclear weapons, this would freeze the situation. both sides would continue to make progress in advancing their technological capabilities. There would be instability. China would not like this development with South Korea and Japan having nuclear weapons. It would put great strains on the U.S. ROK security alliance, on the U.S.-Japan security alliance. I think what is important now, look, South Koreans are understandably very anxious about this growing capability in the North. They're concerned about whether the United States will remain a reliable security partner into the future. Many South Koreans have long had this concern about abandonment. We're going to be left all alone. And they're looking for ways of bringing their destiny under their own control. And one way is to have nuclear weapons. But I think it would be a bad mistake. I think the solution is for the U.S. to work closely with the South Koreans on ways of bolstering the credibility of the U.S. extended deterrent. And there are all kinds of ways that can be done, and we can go into that later. Thank you.
Just very briefly, I read that op-ed, and I wasn't convinced by the core argument, and I noticed that it had an important omission, which was any mention of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If South Korea and Japan were to break out, that would be pretty much the end of the global non-proliferation regime. Extended deterrence, we're talking about it in terms of alliance reassurance, but it's important to recognize that it's not an altruistic enterprise that the United States has put in place. Extended deterrence is one of the best non-proliferation tools the United States has. That old Cold War problem that I talked about of decoupling, I mean, part of the reason U.S. extended deterrence in Europe was so difficult was partly to prevent a German nuclear capability, and those impulses very much are going to come into play increasingly in Northeast Asia as growing domestic constituencies in South Korea and eventually Japan will start calling for an indigenous nuclear capability, which is why this alliance, the alliance management task is just going to grow more difficult in the era of the North Korean ICBM.
Thank you. That was exceptional. We're going to open it up to the floor. Kindly wait for the microphone. Please stand, state your name and your affiliation. Go ahead and take a question. Yes, over here. Gentleman in the blue jacket.
Well, I'm Ron Randall, and we just returned from a tourist trip to South Korea and the DMZ. My question is, how effective is the American deterrence in stopping a response of artillery on the city of Seoul if we were to make a pinprick or very focused attack on nuclear activities? We were told by refugees that the military people around Kim Jong-un don't like him but are scared to death of him, and that there is a potential space between them. I would imagine a senior Korean military person would be really scared of the American response to an attack on Seoul. So my question is, how effective is our deterrence?
Thank you.
I've heard a lot over the years in South Korea, and people say, well, we can strike at North Korea and they won't strike back because of the consequences. And of course, the U.S. could use overwhelming force against North Korea. But I think that just sorely misunderstands the North Korean mentality. And for them, not striking back means almost like they're committing suicide. It's a show of weakness. Right. Well, you're talking about them attacking Seoul, right? Well, if there is a U.S. military action against, say, a missile on a launch pad or some nuclear facility, although that wouldn't make much sense, the North Koreans are going to respond. And I think it's a really serious miscalculation to think that they'll be afraid and they won't respond. There are options out there that are being considered in the context of what I described to you, where we think we can shoot down one of their missiles once it's tested. We would shoot it down over the Pacific, And people think in that case, the North Koreans wouldn't launch a military response on the peninsula. I don't know. I think it's gambling. I think they could have very low-level responses that don't include an artillery attack on Seoul, but still would be a response.
Bob Rankin, did you want to respond, or you're good? Okay, next question. Lady with the red scarf, red and green scarf. Okay, thank you.
My name's Linda Sennett. I have a simplistic question. What does North Korea want? Do we actually have any idea of whatever they do want, how they intend to get it?
Good question. Bob?
This is the big question, and we don't know the answer. They may not know the answer yet. The two different hypotheses. One is that all of these capabilities, the nuclear, the missile tests, the verbal, belligerence, is designed to deter us, that they genuinely fear that the U.S. is determined to undermine the regime, topple the regime, and this will provide deterrence. So in other words, this hypothesis is that the motive is defensive. Another is that no, it's not just defensive. Listen to their doctrine. Their goal remains the reunification of the peninsula on their terms, if necessary by force. Is that why they're acquiring these capabilities? Their ability to threaten the U.S. homeland with a nuclear-armed ICBM. What if their intention is to commit aggression against South Korea and then threaten us with a nuclear attack to try to deter us from coming to the defense of our ally? Is that what they're trying to do? In the middle of those two hypotheses is the notion that, well, maybe it started off defensive, but as they accrue additional capabilities, maybe their ambitions increase. Maybe they become more self-confident that they can pursue provocations with impunity. We just don't know that. But we have to assume, I think, that this is a dangerous regime, and we have to do everything we can to deter provocations. I think it's foolish, by the way, to speak irresponsibly that we would consider initiating the use of military force against the North. And people like Mattis are very careful not to talk about initiating a military attack. But what he does say is that if they commit aggression against our ally or against the United States, there will be a devastating response. And I think that's credible. And I think Kim Jong-un, who is, I agree, he is rational and calculating, and he understands the consequences. And I think deterrence exists today. What I'm concerned about is miscalculation. I'm concerned, that one day we will fly B-1 bombers north of the 38th parallel. Some American pilot will stray into North Korean airspace. Imagine at the SAM, a surface-to-air missile site along the North Korea's eastern coast. You can see a missile, air-to-surface missile operator saying, "Well, let's see, should I fire at that bomber or not?" You may have read in the papers recently a former Soviet military officer died. He was the guy who was alerted by sensors that there might be a U.S. Missile attack underway. But rather than immediately ordering the launch of retaliation, he said, "Does this make sense? Does this really make sense?" And he took it upon himself to say, "This must be a false alarm. I am not going to order a retaliatory strike." And that was that. The incentives for a North Korean captain or lieutenant in that situation go completely the opposite way, because the penalties for failing to act resolutely could be extreme, and not just for his professional career.
Just one very quick point. Bob and I have spent years talking to North Koreans when we were in government, when we were out of government. And that's exactly what you need to do. You're asking the right question. What do they want? Most people don't even bother to ask. They don't bother to talk to them. They just read what the official North Korean media says, which is, just not the right way to go about it. You need to sit, you need to talk, and it could take a long time, but you eventually will figure it out, good or bad. And I think that's what's really needed.
Yeah, thank you.
Just one thing real quickly on this note. So I think, Bob raised the idea of them potentially using their new missile capabilities to engage in new kinds of negotiation with the United States. So everybody remembers this Guam threat that was all over the headlines this August, which was widely misunderstood. It was actually an overture to negotiations, potential talks, but it was effectively North Korea experimenting with a form of compellence. They threatened to carry out this action against Guam if the United States did not cease those bomber flights. And I think we'll see more of that. As North Korea grows increasingly confident behind a credible nuclear capability that's capable of reaching the U.S. homeland, capable of ranging Guam, I think they're going to start experimenting with bolder asks like that. And there will come a day when the United States might have to fold its cards sometimes. And I think, the Guam threat does remain on the table. They never said that they would carry it out. So when some people said, oh, look, they didn't do it, they walked back, I think that's a deadly misreading of how North Korea is thinking about this, the situation. So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Right. And North Korea has also said that they will not engage the United States in diplomacy until they've perfected the intercontinental ballistic.
Whatever that means.
Whatever that means. All right. I'll take someone in over here to the far left. Adria.
Hi, Adria Armbruster. I'm a SAIS grad and a Columbia grad, so thank you for representing here. I have a question. I was born in the mid-'70s. That's all I'm going to say about my age. But at that time, bomb shelters and those types of things were still pretty common in the landscape. And I'm wondering, thinking about the exponential growth of capabilities in North Korea, when do countries, the US, South Korea, Japan, begin to prepare themselves for it? It seems as though we're still in a phase of not taking it seriously, although we are discussing it. So that's my question for all of you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that one?
Japan has very much started preparing. Actually, this has been a really, really terrible year for Japan. Just all of their worst fears about North Korea have started to come true in a way that's maybe not palpable for those of us here. I mean, the two ballistic missile overflights, some reporting said that wasn't the first time. But that was the first time that North Korea flew something that was designed to deliver a thermonuclear warhead over Japan. When they flew the satellites over Japan, those were comparable, but those weren't actual ballistic missiles that they would use in a conflict. And Japan has started ballistic missile evacuation drills. They started conducting those earlier this year. Some of you might have seen the video footage from Hokkaido as the missiles flew over of sirens, air raid sirens going on around the country. Japanese officials have been talking seriously about investing in further missile defense capabilities. Really, ever since 1998, when North Korea launched the Taepodong-1 over Japan, they've been preparing for this eventuality, investing in missile defense. And it's not enough. I think the Japanese will continue to take this quite seriously. And South Korea, I think we've heard a bit about how the South Koreans are preparing. They have the K3 suite of sort of military response capabilities, autonomous response capabilities, the Korea Air and Missile Defense System, the Korea Massive Punishment and Retaliation, and the kill chain. And South Korea is very much making investments in realizing these. There are procedures in place in Seoul to protect the civilian population in case of an artillery strike. Those have been in place for a while. So certainly these countries have been preparing for some time.
Bob or Joel? Okay. I've just been struck with the number of companies. The New York Times did a great piece on companies in South Korea and Japan who are producing gas masks as well as bunkers underground to prepare for some kind of eventual warfare. So I found that interesting. Yes, next question over here. Yes, please wait for the mic. Thank you.
Giosetta Capriati, Foreign Policy Association. Do you think that the Winter Olympics that are taking place, I believe, in February in Pyeongchang, almost at the border with North Korea, where apparently North Korean athletes have been invited, do you think there will be an occasion that Kim Jong-un will will not want to miss to shine on the international stage, and perhaps an opportunity for American diplomacy to step in and calm it down?
Who wants to take that one? Don't all speak at once now.
I'll jump out. You would think so, but I'd be very skeptical about that, particularly in the current environment. I've been in countless meetings with North Koreans, and I was in one meeting where, I won't mention who it was, but it was a prominent U.S. senator was meeting a bunch of North Koreans, and he looked at the North Koreans and he said, well, you have to make the first move. You have to reach your hand out to us to talk. And I knew what the North Koreans were going to say. One of them stood up, this feisty woman who's very important in the North Korean government. She said, why should we make the first move? You're the world's only superpower. You should make the first move to us. We're just a small country. So I think that's the mentality you're dealing with. So in the context of what you're talking about, I don't see the North Koreans really seriously launching some sort of effort at diplomacy. I think the best you could hope for is that things stay fairly calm while the Olympics happen.
Do we need some Dennis Rodman diplomacy? Okay, I'll take someone, Matt, with the glasses.
Thank you. Matt Klein, Financial Times. I'm wondering, this discussion and also the panel before is very much focused on focused on ballistic missiles and the nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering why that is. I mean, I know that's what everyone talks about, but in a certain sense, the threat from North Korea is not really based on the possession of nuclear weapons and missiles per se. It's based on the attitude of the regime. And other countries have nuclear weapons that we find problematic, like Pakistan, for example. We can tolerate them within the international system. So I'm wondering, should we be focusing on this, or maybe there's a different thing? Maybe would accepting the existing sort of status quo make sense, and maybe instead trying to kind of renegotiate the overall relationship? Thanks.
Interesting.
I hate to keep saying, when we talk to North Koreans, but when you talk to a North Korean, you can get at that issue. And their logic is, you've been a threat to us for many years. That's why we built these nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And so at least they say, part of any diplomatic solution has to be a peace treaty. Ending the Korean War. The Korean War hasn't ended. There's a temporary armistice. So, that I think if it ever worked, and who knows, it'd be very difficult, but if it ever worked, that would get at what you're talking about, which is at least changing part of the equation, which is the political relationship. But I would say we don't want to do that and just let everything sort of go. They're weapons of mass destruction. Part of that process has to be them gradually, well, certainly initially freezing, and then maybe down the road, way down the road, reducing, and maybe even further down the road, getting rid of their weapons of mass destruction. But you're absolutely right. At the base of the problem is the political relationship, and that's tough for us because it's hard to accept a regime like that in the United States.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I think you raise a really important point. The United States hasn't really come to terms with a threat like this, an adversarial hostile state acquiring a thermonuclear ICBM. We're seeing that in 2017. The nuclear test they carried out on September 3rd was the largest explosion on Earth in 25 years since China tested a nuke in 1992 at La Panur with a yield of 600 kilotons. So this is a scary time, really. The United States hasn't seen this in a while. The last adversary that met both those criteria was China, Mao Zedong's China, and we learned to live with that and deter that. So I think we're in a period of transition right now. We have an unusual president who is willing to stretch the limits of dialogue at the United Nations. So it is a dangerous time, but my hope is that we'll eventually get to a point where, maybe at least as far as deterrence goes, we start thinking about North Korea as a as a nuclear weapons power, if not a nuclear weapons state under the NPT. But as a nuclear weapons power, it is the 9th nuclear power. And you raise a couple other things. I mean, just a few things have been lost in the noise around North Korea. I mean, issues like onward proliferation of North Korean systems. North Korea is one of the most famous onward proliferators of missile technology, weapons technology. The Scud missile is the most widely proliferated ballistic missile on Earth. North Koreans are incredibly good at refurbishing and modifying those Scud missiles. They've already tested new Scuds this year that they could potentially look to sell those designs to willing customers, especially as the sanctions bite. That could be an important way of acquiring cash. And then the second thing I'll say is their asymmetric capabilities like cyber espionage, cyber theft. Those will be, I think, will continue to get worse in the coming years. And North Korea's capabilities there are nothing to scoff at either.
There's a view among some experts, I think it's a minority view, that what we should do is set the nuclear and missile issues aside. They're too hard, we haven't succeeded. Set them aside and engage with the North Koreans. Try to develop mutually beneficial economic relations, people-to-people exchanges. Try to create, try to alleviate, if you can, North Korea's concern about U.S. intentions to undermine the regime. Do that in the hope that over time they won't see need to have a deterrent. I think no one in positions of responsibility have endorsed that view, and for a number of reasons. The feeling is that this regime needs to have an enemy. So it's going to be very hard to persuade them over time to get rid of the capability they think is essential to hold off the enemy. Also, this is a regime that has very little legitimacy, very few sources of legitimacy. It's most proud of its nuclear and missile programs. They're the only things that they do right, basically. They're proud of them. And that even if through a policy of gradual engagement and cooperation, I don't think it's going to be possible simply to get them to give up this capability. I think, and it's a danger. It's a clear and present danger. And I think you have to go at this capability directly. Sure, there are things you can do on the side. There are confidence-building measures you can do in the conventional military sphere that I think would be desirable to do. But I don't think you can set the nuclear and missile issues aside for very long.
Okay. So we've got 4 minutes left and many questions. So if it's okay with the panel, I'm going to take 3 questions so that we can get as many questions. Is that okay?
Good. Sure.
All right. Over here with the glasses, the red shirt. Okay. Red dress. Yes, you with glasses.
Okay. My name is Davina Lee, and I am a high schooler at Herrick's High School. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous right now. But I just wanted to ask, what cultural and societal impacts have these nuclear testings have had on the South Korean people? And how does the attitudes of the South Korean people have an impact on the stage for future negotiations between the North Korean and the South Korean government?
Okay. Thanks. We'll take one. Next question. We'll go. Okay. You've been waiting patiently over here. The gentleman in the glasses.
I just wanted you to talk about the cyber capabilities they have and how the U.S. What are the U.S.'s capabilities to check that?
Okay. Great. And yes, last question, lady up in front.
Hi, I'm Betsy Scott, fellow Foreign Policy Association. What I was wondering was, I heard a speech recently that theorized that the Chinese are weaponizing North Korea, and that a lot of the hardware you see in North Korea has really come from China. And I'd like to know if that's generally accepted policy. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So we'll start with the first one. What kind of cultural aspects the nuclear testing has had on South Korea? Who would like to take that one? Joel, you seem like you want to take that one.
I'm not sure about cultural aspects, but I mean, the only thing I can say that comes close to societal and cultural is the growing support in opinion polls for South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons. And that's been sort of, it's grown and grown and grown. And, you know, whether it's based on a full understanding of what that means or not is another issue. But that's there, and it's going to be something the United States is going to have to deal with through what some of my colleagues have said, whether it's bolstering extended deterrence or other methods that reassure the South Koreans. But, you know, the bottom line is that, and we saw this in Europe during the Cold War, trying to reassure an ally is an endless task. And sometimes you can't reassure your ally, and at that point, you reach something called strategic divergence, where your alliance starts crumbling. And so this is going to be a real rat race between reassurance and North Korea's unconstrained weapons programs.
Great. On the issue of cyber capabilities, who wants to take that one?
Sure. Just very briefly, there was an interesting revelation, I think, by the New York Times that U.S. Cyber Command had actually retaliated against North Korea's Reconnaissance General Bureau, their equivalent of the CIA, but really it's kind of an organized crime arm of the regime that carries out a range of nefarious activities across the world, including cyber and other asymmetric activities, including the VX assassination of Kim Jong-un in Kuala Lumpur Airport. But, you know, the idea is that attribution of cyber attacks is very difficult, but a lot of recent cyber attacks are thought to have been carried out by North Korea. The WannaCry ransom attack, which ransomed users for Bitcoin cryptocurrency, that was thought to have been orchestrated by the North Korean regime, potential asymmetric means of acquiring cash under sanctions. They pulled off a spectacular heist where they stole $81 million from the Bangladeshi central bank. So I think, you know, these kinds of activities are an interesting way for the North Korean regime to cope with the pressure from sanctions. And actually, the 81 million was actually due to a typo. If the typo wasn't there, they could have stolen up to $1 billion, is what some accounts of that heist have to say. But the United States does have access. I think that story in the Times was meant to signal that Cyber Command had taken a shot across North Korea's bow. I think the operation took place for 8 days, from September 22nd to September 30th, showed North Korea that the United States does have access to its systems, and that if push came to shove, that the United States could retaliate.
On the last point,
China.
I am convinced that China does not want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. I do not believe China has knowingly assisted North Korea, provided technology, materials, and so forth. I do believe that in the past, especially, very lax Chinese controls have permitted North Koreans to shop in China and to acquire certain technology, certain equipment, but I don't think this was sanctioned by the government in Beijing. I think the Chinese are at fault for not cracking down on North Korean brokers and front companies that operate in China and try to procure this technology for their nuclear program. They should have. They're beginning now to do that, but they should have done that, you know, a decade ago.
Well, thank you for a very stimulating discussion. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel.